lecture for week 10. This week we are going to be looking at issues surrounding virtual communities. It's particularly interesting in the light of the bad press that Facebook and Instagram have recently been getting. And while we'll be talking a little bit about the history of virtual communities and how they came to be and why, our goal is to focus more specifically on some of the issues that have been created. So on the screen, we have two quotes from one of our readings. In a recent report, Unethical and Legal Aspects of Human Subject Research on the Internet, Frankel and Sang point to three features of the Internet that pose considerable difficulties in this respect. The blurred distinction between private versus public domain, the ease of anonymous and pseudonymous communication, and its global reach. If you're not familiar with the word pseudonymous, it essentially is the ability to pseudo, false, anonymous, to presume to be or to pretend to be anonymous. And the second is particularly important for some of the issues we're going to be talking about tonight. Contextual integrity is the respect for the explicit and implicit norms governing how much information and what type of information subjects wish to provide about themselves in the myriad situations, transactions, and relationships in which they are involved. Subjects' own sense of relevance and appropriateness of the particular information for the particular set of circumstances is the criteria for contextual integrity. Nussbaum, 1998, argues that individuals have a right to reasonable privacy in public for many activities now subject to electronic surveillance as such as purchasing habits. A couple of things I'd like to note. Number one, we're talking about 1998. If you're not familiar with that year, if we used 1996 as the year in which the internet began to really emerge as a force in society, we're about 2 years after that. At this point, there is no Amazon, there is no Facebook, there is no Instagram. Looking at this from a completely different perspective, and approaching it from a different industry. The rule of thumb in the United States is that if a person is in public, they have given a kind of implied consent to be photographed. Regardless of what they're doing. In France, that rule does not apply. So in the United States, if you're not in your own backyard behind a fence, you are considered in the public domain. And therefore, I don't have to ask permission to collect information in the form of a photograph about you and about your activities. So what we've seen over the course of the last 200 years is that the domain of what is public has increased, while the domain of what is private has decreased. One of the issues which we touched on the last time we spoke about privacy is that, do I have to tell you? I'm collecting information about you. The answer recently has become yes, I do. That has not erased concerns about privacy. But we're not going to spend the entire night looking specifically at privacy. I'm interested in part on looking at, number one, why did virtual communities form? Two, how does the idea of contextual integrity apply? And in the case of social media, why is it so popular? What are the needs that it's fulfilling? And four, how does social media influence the development of virtual communities? Johannes, we clear so far?
Yes.
Okay. So do you remember how Facebook started? What was the point of it initially?
Wasn't it kind of like Tinder?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was an app intended to rate women. And slowly it became more and more inclusive. One of the key concepts is the concept of friend. Why do you think I would point that out?
Because it's like an online friend is not the same thing as an actual friend.
Yeah. Because at one time, the term friend very specifically implied a physical relationship. With Facebook and other forms of social media, MySpace before Facebook, it's a relationship of sorts. And it may or may not be physical. So if we look at the possible set of all of someone's friends, some real life friends are present in the virtual world, but not all. And some of those who are present in the virtual world are not present at all in the real world. So one of the questions we want to ask is, if this were 1920 and the technology were adequate, in other words, if we could duplicate Facebook in 1920, would it still have been successful? What is driving the move increasingly towards virtual communities? And by the way, one recent estimate is that 60% of all marriages now begin with online relationships, which is pretty astounding. Johannes, any questions so far?
I've got no questions, just 60% seems insanely high.
Uh-huh. Yep. Well, the percentage of time that people currently spend on social media is amazing. And some people have wondered if, in fact, it's simply a sign of another addiction in American culture. It may be for some, but I think that there's another reason why this is occurring. Do you remember in the last class we talked about what happened symbolically in 1800?
Um, no, I forgot.
Okay. So if you think about the implications of the fact that most Americans live and die within 15 miles of where they were born, and by the way, on wagon or by horse cart, that's about a half a day's journey. One of the implications is that you always remain in contact with your extended family. So all relationships are physical and in some shape or form so if your father and my father were friends, chances are you and I are going to be friends too. And because we live and die within 15 miles of where we're born, then all of our relationships are very strong. And there is a clear line between public and private. Are we good so far?
Yes.
What happened on the 10th of May of 1869, do you know, in the US?
No, I don't.
Why would the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad be significant to our conversation?
Well, it's a big stepping stone in mobility.
That's
So,
right. And the impact of that would be what?
well, the whole you live your whole life in one place, and that's why all your relationships are strong, kind of falls apart. So people can just move to the other side of the country and just start new.
Yes. And in fact, they do. people begin moving west, Oklahoma is settled in one day. And the pattern of migration, the breaking of those close family ties, will become part of American culture forever. It also gives rise to a new phenomenon in the American workforce called the traveling salesman. So I can leave home on Sunday, travel part way across the country, and return Friday night. Which means, number one, I'm cut off from my family, from my extended family. And two, I am cut off from my nuclear family. So, what do you think the consequence of that will be?
Greater focus on the individual instead of the family.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And what do you think that means?
Well, this kind of leads into the Western worldview where it's it kind of leads into the principle of harm. Well, no, the ones before. It's like I do my thing, and as long as I'm not bothering you, I have the right to do so.
Okay. But that's further down the road. There's something more basic than that.
Then the decline of relationships.
Yes, true. Well, let's go back to the basics. In one of the early classes, we said that one of the aspects of humans that is particularly strange is that we're constantly trying to find a balance between what's social and what's individual. If you remember one of the early conversations we had about Eric Fromm, in Fromm's case, it was a question of our being a part of the physical world, but also being apart from. That same thing applies to our relationship to society. Very few, if any, humans can exist in complete isolation. So if we begin a life that's essentially nomadic, we become the road warrior, as they were called in the 1990s. Then a substantial piece of our needs are not met. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you repeat the word again? How they're called?
Okay.
Just
In
a term
terms
for
of
the
our-
nomadic people in the 1920s.
Oh, okay. They're called road warriors. By the 1990s, they're called road warriors.
1990s. Okay.
Mm-hmm. The difference is that they don't depend on the railroad anymore. It's either a car or it's an airplane. So when I was consulting for AT&T, there were weeks when I would leave home on Sunday night. I wouldn't come back till Friday. And in between, I was at multiple locations. Got to the point where I recognized flight attendants and they recognized me. I'd flown so much. So the whole idea behind the concept of road warrior is that you can always go back, and you should go back at the end of the week. But what's not taken into consideration is that your primary social needs are never met. And that's why we have virtual communities, because the fundamental relationships that we rely on to help shape and nurture our identity are fundamentally broken. Make sense?
Yes, but so virtual communities, does it mean like exclusively virtual or also like keeping in contact with your family over the internet?
Well, it really depends on who you're talking to. I think if we go back to the one of the points I made early on, some number of people, our family, for example, perhaps close friends from home, exist in both the physical community that we belong to, but also virtually. In the early 19th century, you would have sent them a letter. Now you call. If you don't call, you text. If you don't text, you use IM, or you find them on Facebook. Virtual, in the context that we're using it here, is a very broad term. In the 19th century, if you moved from the farm to the nearest city, you would be relying on letters to maintain your tie back to the community at home. This is less about the type of technology and more about the fact that we need to feel tied to family and friends. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Just one thing to clarify. So letter, like communication by letter, this count as virtual in this context.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes. If you think about this process, the very technology that we rely on to maintain our connection to our family and to our friends back home is not adequate. And instead of satisfying the need, it deepens the need. For example, if I moved to the nearest city 30 miles away and the year is 1800, I can pack all of my stuff into my wagon and be home by Friday night. I could pack all of my stuff back in the wagon and be back in the city. You can't do that. Your family's on the other side of the world. And increasingly, that's the way we live our lives. So my quote blood family is 600 miles away, and my daughter is 300 miles away. All of my communication with them is virtual. And some of my family, despite my communicating with them, I have not seen in the better part of a decade. So what we find is that we have communication without intimacy. It's not the communication that we crave. It's intimacy that makes our social situations fulfilling. And that's typically why makes sense.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a but? Okay. I'll assume you're good. So what's happened is that all of this is going away. So aside from our concern about companies collecting data about us, which is very real, we have lost the concept of levels of disclosure, or a word I would prefer to use, if you think about it, on Facebook, there's one category. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the effect of Facebook is that it has ultimately broken the concept of intimacy. It's sort of like being on a diet and having a really tiny dinner. You're going to be terribly hungry for the rest of the night. So the depth of the intimacy that we want does not exist. Make sense?
Yes.
And that's what fuels the addiction. If you remember back at the beginning of the class, we said that Darwin envisioned Darwin assumed that the nation was the end of all social evolution. What we're seeing with social media is that the most satisfying and most fulfilling human social unit might actually be the tribe, which is really your extended family. So if you think about everything that we've seen, and if you think about what happened on January 6th, what we're witnessing is the breakdown of complex societies into their tribal forms. Okay, questions, thoughts?
Isn't like on Facebook, there are more people, like there can be more people connected than in the nation. So wouldn't that make it a more complex social structure?
In one respect, you're right, except for the fact that we are seeing what amounts to tribal warfare. For example, all of those are symptomatic of tears in our social structure. And if you put this in the context of the 2016 election and the aftermath, the famous line of Kellyanne Conway, there are alternate facts, which means example, 20% of all Republicans still believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And 20% of all Republicans still believe that Trump will be reinstated as president. Do you see my point?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, because of alienation and polarization, I live in a self-contained environment where I form my closest relationships with my tribe. I read an article this morning about January 6th, and the comment they made was that there were 7 men who were completely strangers before that day. Yet when they met with each other, they acted as though they were one disciplined unit. In effect, they came together as best friends would have 50 years ago. What do you think? Am I making sense?
I mean, it's a weird context, but you're making sense. Like, it's a weird thing that they come together and act as best friends to like have a revolution.
That's true. But we saw it happen. And to some extent, we see it every day. For example, QAnon. It's the same thing. Or the one that's particularly dangerous, so I can begin with a strong sense of my disliking American foreign policy. I can go to the internet and search for what is referred to as like-minded people. I don't even have to meet them. In which case, I'm a full-blooded member of the community. I've never met a single person in the community. I've become radicalized by their propaganda, so I take action. I'm a lone wolf terrorist. I'm self-radicalized. What we're missing is that this happens because I don't fit in. I'm not accepted. I don't see myself as a member of any other community. So, for example, if I walk into a Walmart and blow it up, I can claim to be a member of ISIS. This happens to a lesser extent. When I buy the team colors in the NFL jersey, for example, and when I wear those colors, I'm now part of the team. And our language changes. You didn't win, you didn't lose. You're not really part of the team, except You are vicariously. And part,
Can you explain that word?
okay, I experience your experience. So, for example, a famous quarterback has the number 4, and his name is Prescott. So I buy a shirt with number 4 on it and his name on it. And now I'm part of his team. So when Americans, for example, in Greensboro, the Panthers, who are out of Charlotte, when I talk to Panthers fans, they always say, well, we just didn't get it together in the game on Sunday. Or our star running back has a hurt ankle. So vicariously, from a distance, I'm experiencing the team as though I were part of it. And that vicarious experience provides me with a sense of belonging. It also provides me with a sense of tribe, which is why we wear the team colors. Questions? Am I making sense? Yes, no? Okay. I'm going to assume I am, because I can't hear anything you're saying at the moment.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I agree.
So when Nussbaum talks about contextual integrity, in part, he's talking about based on the situation and based on familiarity. So if you go back to what we said at the beginning, in the old days, if you were my best friend, I would tell you things I wouldn't tell anyone else. But since the concept of best friend means something very different in a virtual world, then I disclose whatever I feel is appropriate at the moment, which is why you hear people say, too much information. So if I'm living a life that I am not happy with, In Second Life, I can create any life I want. I can have a different wife, different children, different career. I can be wildly successful. I can do anything I want, and I can escape the mundane. And that sense of escaping allows me to build what Freud would call an alter ego, which we call an avatar or a persona. I don't have to fix the problems in my life. I can just have a new life. So, what do you think? Are you ready to join Second Life? All right. So, if we look back again from 1800 to the present day, as we have become increasingly cut off and alienated, our need for community intimacy has gone unmet. But the word privacy in a virtual world does not mean the same thing what it meant 100 years ago. So, given the inherent nature of the problems we face with virtual communities, it would seem that it should be incumbent upon us to actually fix some of our social problems. But we've yet to see that happen in an effective way. Um, if in fact it were working, if the internet were able to compensate us for the sense of being cut off and alienated, then we wouldn't be having the problems we are with pornography and sex trafficking and so forth. We wouldn't be having the problem of the lone wolf terrorist. But all of those social taboos have now been broken. When you read the articles for this week, it's very interesting as well that IBM, after a substantial investment in moving its company to a virtual community, has subsequently backed away. I'm not sure that its decision to do that had everything to do with the inadequacy of virtual communities as much as it did with technical problems within Second Life and the company that owns it. But that can be reserved for another day. So when we ask ourselves about ethical questions surrounding virtual communities, we want to pull that back and ask ourselves, can we build a society in which we can nurture real traditional relationships in a world in which it is highly unlikely that people from the same family will ever occupy the same space? That concludes our lecture for tonight. If you have any questions, you know when office hours are, or you can, of course, email me. Have a good night.